Welcome to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randle and Gus Kearns.
Welcome back to the Screener College Basketball Podcast, where we continue on the train around the country, previewing each and every one of the 357 college basketball teams. I'm your host, Mike Randle. You can follow me on Twitter at RandleRant. Today, we have an old friend of the podcast, one of the best in the business, Chris Solari from the Detroit Free Press, covers Michigan State basketball and football, has provided us with valuable insight. Each and every year we've been doing this, talking about the Spartans. And of course, we head back into this year, and the Spartans are always at the top of the list, both locally, within the Big Ten, and nationally. Follow him on Twitter at Chris Solari. Chris, welcome back to the podcast, man. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for doing this. It's nice doing it in this format and actually see you and kind of doing it. I think we've done it over the phone the last couple times.
Yep, and I owe you a beer when we get that Big Ten tournament out here. I'm going to go out and thank you for all this and give you a couple beverages and laughs as well. So great having you on. And I want to start with last year. I've asked everyone here. We've had beat reporters, people in the business, as well as head coaches. COVID. How did it impact the Spartans last year? How did it go, particularly at the beginning and when the quarantines were happening throughout the season?
I think the biggest issues came in January because they were, Michigan State started off hot. I mean, they were 6-0 coming out of non-conference season, and then things just went awry. I mean, they had a game at Northeastern that they lost, and then they lost the Christmas Day game against Wisconsin. And then there was I think it was a 50-50 game really with Purdue. They came down to a last-second shot, and then everything shut down for them. They had a 21-day pause. They lost Josh Langford when he was starting to finally get back to a better full strength, closer to full strength as he had been, and he had COVID, and that affected him. I think pretty much every guy on the team except maybe two had COVID. So it played a big factor, maybe not necessarily in the amount of cancellations, because they did have games canceled. And you saw, I think if you watched the game that they played at Rutgers coming out of their COVID pause, you saw the realities of it. They didn't shy away from it. They went in straight off the pause to show just how much it disrupted, because I was at that game, and it was not the same Michigan State team you saw before that pause, and it wasn't the same team you'd see after that pause, as they somehow managed to scrape it all together down the stretch and play. Once they finally got about a month past their own COVID issues, they started to play really good basketball.
8-3 after the win at home against Rutgers. In Rutgers, of course, we're in New Jersey, was strong, and that was an impressive 68-45 win. And then the pause hit right after Purdue, that 1-point loss at home, and then things did go awry. I guess we're just conditioned, Chris, to say that Tom Izzo's going to get it together. They're going to start rolling. And we headed into the Big Ten Conference tournament. They were struggling back and forth. They did beat Michigan at home on Sunday, March 7th, which I thought was a great win, and then the loss to Maryland. I'm curious, what was the mindset going into the Big Ten Conference tournament as well as the NCAA tournament, which we'll get to, because I do feel, Chris, that was like a sliding doors situation with UCLA. But talk about after the win at the end, 15-11, 9-11 within the Big Ten. How are they going into the conference tournament?
I think they expounded pretty much all of their energy down the stretch to continue the NCAA tournament streak. And that, you look at those games that they won, the back-to-backers with Illinois and Ohio State in particular, they were left for dead at that point. They were basically considered and counted out of that tournament. But they had enough games left in that stretch, with two final ones against Michigan and those games they won at home against Iowa or Illinois and Ohio State, that you looked at it, and if you looked at it from a mathematical standpoint, you realize that you can win a couple of these games, you can make the run, and you can get back to the dance. And that's what they did. And particularly that last Michigan game, I think that was, the wrapping up the regular season against Michigan at home was the emotional pinnacle of that season, because they realized at that point, we got the upset of the number 2 team in the country. We're going to get, that's 3 upsets down the stretch in the final however many games. That to me was the moment where there was a little bit of a sigh of relief because they pushed and they tightened up so much just to get to that part where they would continue Tom Izzo's NCAA tournament streak.
It was impressive. I mean, beating Illinois, beating Ohio State, beating Michigan, and you had some big performances there from players that needed to show up. In that Michigan game, Aaron Henry, 18 points, 5 rebounds, Rocket Watts, 21 points. There were players, Chris, that I think, veterans, Michigan State guys who really started to peak towards the end of the year, even though I wouldn't say that there was one, sort of overall really game in, game out dominant player.
Yeah, and it's one of the guys who did kind of elevate his game in the second half of the year was Marcus Bingham. I think Bingham came along quite a bit. I think they found a group in that roster that basically didn't have a point guard. I mean, they used Langford, they used Henry, they were basically the primary ball handlers, and then because Rocket Watts was more comfortable off the ball, and then they brought Rocket Watts slowly back into the fold as a point guard at times, and I think in that Michigan game in particular, may have been in many ways his best game as a Michigan State player. Things obviously didn't really work out beyond that, and Watts had such an up and down season. And when I say up and down, I mean it started up and then it went down significantly until that Michigan game. But some of the other guys down the stretch, I mean, Joey Hauser was a big key to that stretch because he was an MIA player after the non-conference season.
And he had a Chris, big game when he was on, it changed the dynamic of the Spartans.
Absolutely, because I mean he's that true stretch four that really works in Izzo's offense, and when he was. I mean, you looked at that early part of the season when Michigan State had the ball movement going, when they were swinging. I mean, it looked like Cassius Winston's team in a lot of ways, maybe even a step better in the 6 non-conference games when they, Notre Dame and Duke. They were swinging the ball, they were attacking, and then all that stopped with Hauser. I mean, I think Hauser had the big game against Wisconsin on Christmas Day, and really wasn't the same after that. You talk about Watts' production. I mean, Hauser was struggling to produce. He was a liability on the defensive end. That really was a major factor because couldn't figure out how to match him up against a 4 when he was getting eaten up, and he couldn't play a smaller guy. He couldn't play a bigger guy usually. So I think that honestly, that's kind of what you see with transfers who come into Izzo's system, after a sit-out year, even though they've been going through practice, it usually takes a year to kind of adapt to his defensive mindset and philosophy. So it's going to be interesting to see where Joey Hauser is this year on the defensive end compared to a year ago. But he definitely made a factor down the stretch. And I think a lot of it was Tom Izzo finding his rotation and really trusting in Aaron Henry to kind of be an alpha. And that was something that Aaron Henry struggled with in his 3 years. There were points where he would defer when he was there with Cassius Winston and Xavier Tillman and that group and Nick Ward a few years earlier. And there were times last season when he would do the same thing. And he's the guy who pulled his name out of the NBA draft to come back. You want to make an imprint, you got to be able to do that. And I think it was around maybe the Indiana win that he started to kind of embrace that, and not trying to be a complimentary player, but being the guy. And that was really another factor. You needed Aaron Henry to play like an alpha down the stretch, and he did.
And let's get to the tournament game. This what hits home, Chris, because from a bracketology college basketball guy who's, making picks in March, we know the winner of one of those quote unquote first 4 games always gets hot. My pick was the Spartans. I thought that bracket set up for the winner of that game with UCLA to go pretty far. I liked Abilene Christian over Texas because I thought they were underrated, the rivalry there. And then we moved on, Alabama, etc. Talk about that game because there was a double-digit lead for the Spartans at halftime, and then I feel like the light went on for the Bruins, and they went all the way through the tournament. So talk about that one because I think, Chris, that could have been Michigan State.
It absolutely could have, and I think it helped a lot of people in their brackets inadvertently, because you just had the seed line. You circle the seed line in that, and it didn't matter who came out of it, and they went deeper into your bracket the better you were. And so if you
Yes.
said Michigan State, you said UCLA. They struggled. They struggled defensively in that game down the stretch, and Juzang in particular really lit them up, and they were struggling off the bounce.
He lit everybody up in the tournament too.
He did. And they struggled with the attacking guards, and I think that's where you saw the liability maybe of a Rocket Watts on the defensive end. That he had been such a good defender as a freshman, and then last season he struggled and really got taken off the dribble a lot. And I do think that if you look down the stretch in that game, and Tom Izzo would point to this, the little things, the minor details that a team needs to do to win a game. The Purdue game, it's amazing, because the loss that they had to Purdue was a failed box out on a free throw by Aaron Henry that really cost them. And that's what cost them in the game against UCLA to send it to overtime and eventually be the loss. Ironically, of course, at Purdue, which, there's a whole, where's the John Wooden specter in all of this, right? I mean, the Purdue and UCLA factor overlapping and really ending this. But, that's, I think, ultimately what it was. This team had issues with the details, with those little things like that they didn't really have that primary scorer, but they had guys that could get hot on a given night and share the ball. But, if you're giving it up at the other end, that was the other problem. So there were a lot of deficiencies that came out about this team over the course of the season. How much of it was COVID related is really, that's going to be the case with anybody that struggled last year. You're always just going to wonder, were guys gassed? Were they just not thinking straight compared to how usually? Because, I mean, listen, Aaron Henry, one of the things I saw in him early in his time at Michigan State during the summer league, he was just a guy that made other people around him better. So the flaw of not boxing out, and he was told multiple times to box out in that moment, and that's a preaching point for Tom Izzo. Free throw box out is a major preaching and teaching point. And for it to cost them 2 games really, kind of tells you the tale of the season.
So we turn to this year, and a lot of changeover. You have a big transfer coming in. Talk about the players that you're losing here at Michigan State, because I do think that not having the point guard, it's critical. It's critical for every team, but especially the great ones. I ended up talking to Jerry Tipton about Kentucky the other day. He said, look, we really didn't have a point guard for most of the year, and then Davion Mintz ended up stepping up, who was the transfer from Creighton. So Aaron Henry, as great as he was, isn't your traditional point guard. But talk about the players that are leaving, then we'll get into the transfers and the freshmen coming in.
Yeah, and that guy was supposed to be Rocket Watts, and the thought was slide Watts over to replace Cassius Winston, and Watts never really embraced being that not a point guard per se, but a lead guard, a Kalen Lucas type, a guy that could take the ball and attack off the dribble. He fell in love with his jump shot, and oftentimes bad jump shots, which those lead to long rebounds and breakouts the other end. So that was a problem. So he's going to transfer. He's out. There's Thomas Kithier is gone. You lose Langford, you lose Aaron Henry. I mean, there's a lot of experience. Jack Hoiberg also transferred out, and he got some minutes down the stretch. And it's going to be interesting, because I think the guys that they bring back, like,
and Foster Loyer is at Davidson. Did you go Davidson?
Yeah, Foster Loyer was the other one, and Foster Loyer was. I mean, the thought was at the point guard spot he would be a guy that you could pair and put in a limited role with Watts. Well, again, the defensive liability factor. I mean, because he wasn't equipped to handle bigger guards, and any coach that has a chalkboard in front of them or a dry erase board was drawing up plays to go right at Foster Loyer, and it was just a Mack truck over him at times, and that's no fault of Foster Loyer. And the other problem with him is that he was never able to fully get his jump shot integrated, and he wasn't going to have plays run for him. So he had to create on his own. And, being a little undersized, I think, kind of bit him at the Division I level. And it'll be interesting to see how he ends up at Davidson. And it's going to be definitely interesting to follow Watts. I believe he ended up at Mississippi State. So he went from one MSU to the other. Because I think Watts has a world of talent. I just think that it got to a point where he just had to kind of get a new start. It was, he's got the ability to play the point guard. He's got to have the desire to play that, because he's going to be a little too undersized to play the two. And when the shot selection is as poor as it is right now, you got to be able to improve that if you want to have a chance at that next level.
And you bring in Tyson Walker. Tyson Walker, point guard from Northeastern, had a great year. 18 points a game, almost 19 points a game, 5 assists, super quick, 2.5 steals, defensive player of the year in the CAA. They tied with James Madison there at 8-2 for the conference. I would think, there are some turnovers that can occur with him. He's high with the turnovers, but the defensive presence that he brings, and he is a point guard here, Chris, I would think that's kind of the focal point as we move into 2022.
There's no surprise that Tom Izzo went after a point guard who has such a good defensive pedigree. Mm-hmm. That's, he loves to use the phrase, just, the head of the snake. You cut off the head of the snake, the body will go crazy. Mm-hmm. And when you've got a guy, that holds true for the defensive end. That everything on their defensive side is orchestrated and created on the ball at the point. And it's going to be interesting to see where Walker is in that system. We talked about Hauser struggling to adapt. I think Walker, just simply because Izzo's being a former point guard and having, there's a school of thought that he is a very good guard coach, and that's ultimately what he's always been. So, he's going to bring him along quickly. And, and they've got more guys, I think, that are going to be able to handle the ball. I think A.J. Hoiberg came along at points last year. He was rushed. I think Hoiberg, to me, he had a pretty good freshman year by all accounts, because he wasn't supposed to even be in that chair, running the point and starting games. And they ended up having to start him at times. And I thought, when he gets his play under control a little bit and isn't trying to do everything, I think he's going to be a very good complementary player. And then they bring in, Max Christie and Jaden Akins. So you got more guys than Pierre Brooks, all guys that can handle the ball. Most of those guys are wings, but Akins is a flexible enough guy that he could play the one or the two. So you're going to have some guys that can run the offense for Tom Izzo. And it's going to be interesting to see how those guys blend together, because I think it's also maybe going to be maybe one of his more versatile teams, particularly on the perimeter.
Yeah, he's going to be deep. Hogarth last year, 4-star recruit, came in. I agree. I think he needed a little more time to develop, which is fine. It's just maybe a luxury they didn't have. Max Christie, the big recruit here, Chris, 5 stars, number 1 in Illinois, 19 nationally, top 20 guy, 6'6", 200-pound shooting guard. I see him and Tyson Walker in the backcourt. We're starting to shape up a little bit. Recruiting class, second best in the Big Ten, right behind Michigan. Nationally, they're top 10. So this is, Michigan State always gets their guys, and they fit in. But I think there's a pretty strong group coming in.
It is. And I think the key is going to be how they blend with the guys that are there, because I think that the upside still hasn't been reached with guys like Gabe Brown and Malik Hall. I think those two guys in particular, and Marcus Bingham as well. Those are guys that still have high ceilings that they can reach. And when you look at the complementary players they brought in, I think a guy like Christie is the knockdown shooter that they've wanted for a while, and maybe been missing since maybe Gary Harris. At the two, Langford had his moments like that where he was that guy, but he was so injured and out of the lineup in the final couple of years that, it wasn't necessarily the same player as he was developing into his sophomore year. And I think Christie, from all accounts over at Breslin Center, is just a dead-eye shooter. And maybe it could end up being one of the best that Izzo's had. And with that size, I think that definitely is going to be. I mean, he's a star in the making. And Brooks and Akins has, when we talk about Tyson Walker being that traditional point guard, Akins is more of that combo kind of guard that can be a lead guard who attacks, and he's got some springs. He might be with his ability to get to and finish at the rim. He might be one of the more electric guys with the ball in his hands that Izzo's had. So I mean, that it was a very good guard class, and Brooks is a bull in a china shop. I think that's going to be, watching him. And here's the other thing: they've got 2 open scholarships. So between now and the beginning of the season, I don't know if Tom Izzo will use those scholarships. If there ends up being a last minute transfer situation, that could be a factor. But he also has 2 football players who he's bringing in to kind of complement the roster, and Malik Carr, who transferred in from Purdue, and Keon Coleman, a kid from Louisiana, who was a dynamic scorer there. So those guys are freakish athletes that can play at this level. So it's not like he's just bringing in walk-ons. He's bringing in guys that, from the football team that can play. If, depending on how long it's going to take them, if they get there in January, I don't know how much they're going to be able to give, but they're certainly going to be interesting players to watch because they've got that physical ability to, at minimum, elevate practices and maybe give them a couple minutes off the bench.
Now, Michigan State, 3 years in a row prior to last year, Big Ten regular season champions. Last year slipped to, I believe, 9th, of course, back and forth, schedule, COVID, the whole thing. So talk about the upcoming non-conference, because I would think, Chris, the start to the year is going to be very, very important. Hopefully we'll have fans back. Things will get a little bit back to normal. You have Tyson Walker coming in. You have a great recruiting class. I would think the Spartans are like, look, last year was last year. Now we want to step forward and get back to where we normally are. And I would think that starts with the non-conference.
It does. And they haven't released their full non-conference schedule just yet, but the big thing is going to be the tournament in the Bahamas and the battle for Atlantis. I think that field there is deep and it's talented. There's a side plot of Tom Izzo going against Drew Valentine in his early infant stages.
Yes.
The Lansing kid who was a grad assistant for him, and that's going to be a fun one to watch. I'm still figuring out if I'm going to get to the Bahamas because I think that's one I want to see in person. And then Baylor's going to be there. VCU's there. I can't remember the full gamut, but I mean, there are going to be some early season games as always with Michigan State. And I think, you saw it last year, with the shortened non-conference season and the shortened, the Big Ten. The Big Ten basically made the whole way through the 20-game schedule with a few blips here or there. I think Michigan State ended up playing 17 of ended up playing all 20 of their games. Now there were some disruptions in there, but they managed to get through them. But I don't know how that's going to play out this year. We're going to have to still wait and see what the schools decide they want to do. But having a full non-conference and a normal non-conference schedule, I think for Tom Izzo is important because he's able to identify playing groups. He's able to mix and match guys a little bit more, and he's willing to do that. I think early in the Big Ten season last year when they struggled is because they only had 6 non-conference games. He didn't have a lot of time to tinker, and he's a tinkerer. He's absolutely a tinkerer, but his tinkering in November and December oftentimes leads them to finding the right solutions to the roster that he wants to have playing in the playing group down the stretch. And I think it just took them, a little bit longer last year because they didn't have the full non-conference. So this year, bringing in those 4 guys and whoever else that they may bring in, I think that's certainly something that he wants to be able to identify when they get into Big Ten play.
Chris, amazing stuff. So comprehensive here in the Spartans. Last question, then I'll get you out of here. Really appreciate a few minutes. What's your projection? I am thinking that heading into the year, Michigan State is going to be viewed as a back-end top 25 team. That's just a guess, maybe 2018. but they have the potential to rise very quickly. And if they're under the shadow of people thinking Michigan or teams like that, the big guy coming back for Illinois, Coburn, of course, where do you think they're going to start, and how do you think the season's going to go?
Yeah, I think in large part because the veterans who are back are the guys who we mentioned who have the high upside and have a lot to prove. Joey Hauser, Gabe Brown, Malik Hall, Marcus Bingham. I think those guys that come back, they've got a world of talent. They just have not been in that role other than maybe Hauser of being an important factor in this. So the college basketball world's going to find out quickly about Max Christie and Jaden Akins. I think they're going to be key parts of this team. I'd probably agree with you, though. I think they will be probably, in that probably 16 to 20 range. Maybe a little bit farther back than that. They're not going to be predicted right out of the gate to be the Big Ten champion. I do think Illinois is going to be that, but they're going to be the favorite. And where's Michigan State fit in that? Probably in that 3 or 4 range. And that's kind of how Tom Izzo likes it. He likes being a little off the radar, but right at the top, gunning for people. Although he has gotten accustomed to, over the course of the last few years and last couple decades, being the hunted. So when he's got a little bit of a chip on his shoulder, I think he tends to bring out a little bit of his fiery side and some of his best coaching. So I think that anything short of getting out of that first weekend of the NCAA tournament will be a disappointment, because I think this team has some pieces, if it meshes together, to make a decent run.
Totally agree. Chris, amazing job. Folks, Chris Solari, the Detroit Free Press, does a wonderful job. He's in football right now. He gave us a few minutes on basketball. Follow him on Twitter at Chris Solari. Chris, great job, man. Good luck with the AD search as well at Michigan State. Got a lot going on there, but we're certainly excited to have college basketball and hopefully a full stadium back. Really exciting. And the Spartans are always at the top, and they're going to peak at the end of the year. Thanks so much for a few minutes here.
It's never dull in East Lansing, that's for sure. Thanks, Mike.